Am I live?
You are.
Thank goodness. Good. Where's Melanie? I can't see Melanie. There she is.
Oh, backstage. No. I was just waiting.
Hold on 1 second, all right?
Where's Melanie?
I had my other computer on over there, and I think we're getting some reverb. But welcome to the hard truth that with still, after all this time, have not yet mastered the intro whatsoever. So I still managed to not to be confused as to whether I'm live. So this what are you doing?
Just making a note.
I knew it. God damn it.
Making notes of all the things you say today.
That's a great segue into this week's topic because I also have made notes.
Right.
So this week we're going to talk a little bit more about toxic relationships, but specifically related to child custody issues, because there's been a lot of interest about that in our circle of people, and the feedback we've been getting. So, boy, there's a lot going on in terms of the research and what happens in the United States. And I would love to get your feedback on this, Melanie, because it's going to be very interesting. Since you've gone through, just full disclosure, I've never been through a child custody battle other than as an expert and as an advisor. But almost all the people in my life who are close to me, including you, Melanie, have gone through these issues. So, and it's a different experience as an expert than it is as a person who's a parent. But as a parent, there are levels to which I can empathize, but also levels to which I understand what's going on. So we want to talk about, how do I say this? When you have a situation in which you are a parent and there's a child custody situation that results from a divorce or a separation or what have you, there's a danger that is already in place that I don't think most people are aware of. And let's talk about the progression that goes through a relationship that sets up the person who is not the aggressor to lose custody, because this is one of the most frustrating issues, right? We're seeing it in a lot of our cases where the person who's actually the victim of violence, when the children are victim of violence, they're not the ones who get custody. And this seems to anybody from the outside looking in to be insane, right? That's pretty, in your experience, is that pretty common, or are you having a different experience and seeing different things?
No, it's extremely common. It goes along with what I'm sure we're going to touch on, but like the smear campaign and all that, when they try to flip it, the abusive party tries to flip it to make the other person or other parent, I should say, look crazy or unstable. And it just becomes a ridiculous, it's almost like it's just a ridiculous show that's being played out in front of them. And it's very hurtful. And they're using the kids as pawns in most cases. So the kids end up staying either in joint custody with the two parents going back and forth, or with the one who's actually abusive. I see it here all the time too. It's the same thing. Yeah.
And you've just sort of described it very well. Let's talk about what that looks like from a professional context. This is really about the spiral of violence. As we have talked about before, Dr. Coronado and I, we just published our book on criminal psychology, and we talk about the concept of the domestic violence cycle not being a two-dimensional cycle that is flat and looks, very two-dimensional from the outside, where it reboots and just does the same thing over and over again. That's from the outside. From the inside, it's a spiral. It gets ever worse, with ever worse trauma and violence being normalized, until at the very end, something dramatic happens. And it can be a divorce, a separation, or it can be a homicide, right? Or femicide. So let's talk about this progression of manipulation, because you set it up perfectly. It's almost like we talked about this beforehand, even though we didn't.
We did not.
Zero preparation, as per usual. Just the hard truth in a very unfiltered sense. So when you're in a relationship that's bad, that's toxic, you aren't going to know it right up front. And the person who's setting you up is going to set the stage in such a way so that at a later time, you will be viewed as the person who is unstable, unreliable, and, for lack of a better term, insane, crazy, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do we do this? First thing is they engage in social control. They control you by alienating you from your group of people. And they do this by the emotional control they exert over you. They get intimate access to you. There's the love bombing access. You're the most special person. You make me feel amazing. I couldn't do this without you. I'm becoming I'm becoming the better version of myself. All this bullshit, right? Because, that's not how that works. But so they do all this to create the illusion of specialness that allows them to separate them from their other emotional support, friends, family, workplace. They might even get angry that you're actually working. They might try to make it so that you rely upon them completely for everything, from emotions to intimacy to financial. And that's the next realm. The next realm is financial control. So social control, emotional control, financial control. And if you are, quote unquote, in love, then you are going to buy into that. You're going to believe, oh my gosh, yes, this is what love is. This is the fairy tale. This person is going to take care of me. This person is going to help me. I'm helping them become the best version of themselves. And oh my gosh, I'm going to become the best version of myself with this person. This fantasy that you're creating together that has to necessarily exclude all reality and also allows them to gain control over you. And you may not know what's going on. You might think that this is what love is, or this is what a relationship is. It is not. Well, let's talk about this very quickly. In a relationship, I want to say some things, and I want you to respond to this, Melanie. So take notes. The first one is, in terms of not letting you have access to your own money, that's always a bad thing. Not letting you talk to certain people with your phone, that's a bad thing. Going through your phone is a bad thing. Not letting you work is a bad thing. Showing up at your work unannounced to, talk to people and do things that are sort of outside that norm. That's a bad thing. This is all about control. Talking to your parents without you there, about you, right?
Yes.
All these things are a form of control that are not acceptable. And if you did them to the abuser, if you did them to the person trying to set it up, that's how you know it's wrong, because it's not a two-way street. First of all, it's always bad to have that much access and control to anyone, even in a relationship. I've learned that too many times. I give too much trust, I give too much access, and it just becomes a chain with which the person is controlling and checking on you all the time. It's very unhealthy. But really, it's about understanding that you get to have your boundaries, you get to have access, you get to have your friends, you get to have your work, you get to have your life. Too many relationships are premised on the notion that you don't get these things, and people enter them thinking, oh, I don't get to have a life. I have to have full and open access. Respond to that a little bit, because I think that's something that, if we can avoid that from the outset, a lot of people would be helped from entering into relationships that are going to be harmful to them.
I agree. I think it's difficult. I guess let me start with when people will say, like, how did you not see this from the beginning? I don't think anyone who hasn't experienced or is just starting to realize that they are in a toxic relationship, it's slow. It is a slow transaction sort of situation that's happening one thing at a time, months, years, things like that. It's not sudden. Now, that being said,
let me interrupt you and say, if it is sudden, then you obviously know it's really bad.
Well, that's what I was going to say. If we are going from
a very short period of time, that's bad. But usually it's not. So sorry, continue.
Right. I was going to say, sir, that if it goes from love bombing to move in to get married within a matter of weeks or months, that's an obvious sign of what's happening. Yeah. There are other relationships that go through this cycle of violence, that it is a slower buildup. You might not be understanding what the love bombing is, so it goes on for a few months, 6 months, something like that. And then I find that in my own experience, like, let's talk about the financial portion of it.
Yeah, that's interesting.
In my own experience, in that toxic relationship, a lot of people get the idea that you just don't have access to the funds. Like the abusive person is in charge of all the accounts, is paying, doing all of that. Now, mine was slightly different. It was all my money being used. I had full accessibility, but I was the one paying for everything, and they were not doing anything. It was like, I got this new business idea, like, pay for this, and we're going to do this. And I was the one that had full accessibility to all the money, but I had no control over the money, even though it was my money.
But so you made the money, you put it into joint accounts or joint credit cards, and they used it all.
Even if it was in my own personal account, it would be brought to me as such of, if you don't do this, it's going to be like, I'm going to be really depressed. This is my next big break. And when you're in that, and like you said, you think you're in love, more so it's like a trauma bond. But
Well, you
you're
think that's
like,
what love
maybe
is.
this will make it better.
This
Right.
unconditional access, this unconditional
Right.
resource sharing.
Like
But
we're
it's
a
only one way.
partnership.
That's the problem. It's only one way.
That's right. I wasn't receiving any money or any, the only thing I received was collection bills because the stuff that person was supposed to be taking care of was just non-existent.
Well, I had to, in my marriage, I had to take over our finances because my ex, basically for 8 months, she was in charge of paying the mortgage and she didn't pay it.
Mhm.
And I didn't realize that. And I was getting calls. I'm like, what the hell is this? So I get on the phone. This is like 2007, 2008. And I'm like, okay, well, they're not paid. I've been giving the money to her to make these payments. She didn't make them, but all the money was there. And this is what I learned about her. She wrote an email to me after we separated that basically confessed all of it, where she said, the reason I spent every nickel you had is to make sure that you couldn't leave. This was because I wasn't making a lot of money, but I was afraid of you leaving. So I just spent everything you had. And I just would go onto your Amazon account. I would go on to I would take the credit cards and I would just max them out as much as I could. And we would get, 8 to 10 packages a day, every day, because she's doing that. And, it's very bad. It's very, very bad. So the financial control, like you said, isn't just about blocking access to funds and when you don't have a job. It can even be when you have the job and you are making the income and they're just spending it like crazy.
And it was the same explanation. The explanation after the fact was that if I didn't have any money, I couldn't go anywhere. I was stuck.
Yeah.
There was nowhere for me to go. So then when you are the person in that, the one being abused, you start secretly putting away cash, because once you start to realize where you are in this cycle, you have to have that put away. But don't let that be found or you're going to have a rough day.
I was never that smart. And then I wound up having extra cash that we would keep in the safe. And that would just be, I did that for the family. So the family would have it and they had access to it. And that just got spent. Anytime I left town to go do anything, I'd come back, it'd be empty. And we're talking thousands of dollars. It wasn't small amount.
Yeah. When I was saving money, when I saw that this was happening and I was looking for a safe way out, which we'll get into as well, when you're the woman in the abusive relationship, how dangerous it becomes when you do leave.
Yeah.
So I was taking that extra money to a neighbor, and they were putting it in their house for me so that it would never be found.
Man, that's brutal. That's brutal.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was never that smart. One time, Valeria Baltazar says, hi, Valeria. One time, the many that I tried to break up with Max, he went to my dad's job to look for him and request him to do something about us, the relationship. I don't know until days later because my dad, he went to the father, right? Going and talking to the parents. And also trying to make friends with the security guard at your place and also your neighbor, right? I mean, this was, I know a little more about that situation, but it's when they're doing that kind of stuff, it's an attempt to control and manipulate.
Right. On that point, I had a similar, what was it, a couple of years ago where that happened too. And I found that once the person who was in control and manipulating, once they started to lose control, that's exactly what they did. Went to my parents, went to all of my neighbors, my friends, and tried to ask questions about me and turn everyone against me. I guess that was the goal, which didn't end up working. It just got a no contact order by police. But that's exactly what they did.
Right? Not even just trying to control you, but just trying to create the narrative that other people can pressure you back into the relationship.
And to make me look like the crazy person.
Right.
Because it's also what we're discussing today. It was also in an attempt to make everybody, if they got called to court in a custody situation, right? That's where this was going.
So any reaction that you give to what they're doing can be cast by you and be repeated by your family as being somehow aggressive, hostile, or for lack of a better term, crazy. And I was talking to Aurelia. I'm like, well, how do we describe this? Is it just resistance? And he goes, yeah, this is when you're resisting someone's attempt to control you or to isolate you or to manipulate you, you have to characterize it as that. You have to make sure that you are making it clear that your response is resistance to that idea. All right. The resistance is not the same as being violent or unreasonable. You are not required to be reasonable when someone's got their boot on your neck. Mm-hmm. But that, by the way, the courts actually believe that's what you're supposed to do. And we know that because that's how law enforcement officers are trained. That's how Derek Chauvin is dead. Because so many people say the same thing. Well, if he just not resisted arrest. If you just don't resist arrest, the police won't kill you. If you just let it happen, isn't that the same advice that too many men give victims of sexual assault? Just let it happen. Judges say shit like that.
Just let it happen. It's safer that way.
It's the language of the aggressor and the abuser. And very often that is adopted by and incorporated into court rulings. One of the things that Aurelio does when he's doing a child custody evaluation is he's very good at spotting very gendered terms and stereotypes inside of professional reports and inside of legal rulings. That's a pretty important thing to do. So let's move forward now to the next part that we were hinting at. This is a really good resource. I think it's very interesting, the amount of love bombing that goes on. What is love bombing, when it is love bombing, when it's not, and then also the expectation that creates and what can happen when it goes wrong, and what it represents in terms of our ability to communicate effectively with each other. So let's talk about now when you're aware that you have been socially isolated, that you are economically in crisis or under control because of this person, and you are trying to regain emotional, financial, and social control of your life. What happens immediately? The response will be gaslighting. Gaslighting is an assault. It's an attempt to correct and control the person who's resisting. When you are resisting these attempts to control you and isolate you and set the stage for future battles, you are going to be gaslit into thinking that what you're seeing is not true, what you're seeing is not real. So your resistance creates gaslighting. The more you resist, the more the gaslighting increases. And only a couple things can happen at this point. And one of those things is, separation and divorce. And those are the lucky ones, but they're not even that lucky, because now what you've got is they've also been, if you've got children involved, it keeps even more messy. And it takes somebody who's exceptional to leave a terrible relationship with somebody who's lying to them or hurting them and hurting their child, to leave them early on, like when they're pregnant or right after they give birth. That's an exceptionally brave choice, and not one that I think that any woman would ever make lightly. Talk to us about that a little bit, because I think that gets discussed wrong.
Yeah, I think it's also a traditional sort of outlook that if you go, we talked about this last time, but if you're talking to your family or you're going to your friends and you're asking advice, say you are pregnant or you just had a newborn, the same response from everyone is, well, you can't leave now. Like, how are you going to do this alone? What are you going to do? Then they ask all these questions and make it that you should just suck it up. Like you just said, just let it happen. Just keep going. You got yourself into this position. Then it's turned into an attack on the female. Like, well, why would you get yourself into this position then? And then
that is the other part. Let's talk about that for a second, because the way the courts, law enforcement, and even attorneys view mothers is that they are supposed to be the ones taking care of the children. If a male doesn't do it, well, that's just men playing out their role. But who's really responsible? And if you this is a horrible thing to say, but in social media, when you see people on social media responding, they're responding in these gendered terms where the woman has the greater obligation to be healthy, honest, and provide for the child, even when the male is just being completely abusive and traumatic. Mm-hmm. It's always on the female. This is because of the traditional construct we have of the family, which is a bank. The family construct is great for banks and churches. And it helps them. It does not help people.
Mm-hmm. I've also seen some mixed reviews. I'm not going to call it any sort of scientific research, but I've seen some psychologists and counselors coming out saying that now they believe that even if there is toxicity within the parents' relationship, that it is detrimental for those parents to split up for the kids. Whereas before, they were saying that a child being raised in a toxic environment is more detrimental than splitting the family up. Yep. So now women are probably really confused because we are trying to do what's best for the kids. In my situation, I never, ever thought it wasn't about me the entire time. All I could think of, because I'm raising girls, is that I do not want them to grow up and be in a relationship like this because this is what they think is normal. I want better for them as they grow up. So I am going to do what I can, get out of the relationship, and then start everything I can to support them through that journey. right? There's trauma, of course there is.
Yeah.
But I did all the research prior to that to try to do what was best for them in the long run. And I'm going to pat myself on the back, but I made the right decision. These girls are doing really well, and I've supported them through it. And they're getting to the age where they're starting to pick up on the toxicity of the parent anyway, the other parent, right? So
That's really good. And thank you for sharing that, because that's really important. So let's talk about this in that context. This is the biggest bias, the biggest hurdle that anyone has to get over when they're dealing with the justice system. You have a bias in terms of many agencies believe wrongly, law enforcement, judges, attorneys, they believe wrongly that parents have a constitutional right to have access to their children, no matter what, no matter how abusive, how criminal, how dangerous. But that's a pro-parent notion, and ultimately it's a pro-family, pro-religious notion, pro-banking notion. Banks and religion love this, but it is not pro-child. What gets silenced, what gets made invisible, is the child. The child is the one that should be making these decisions. The child, or at least queried on it. And if they are too young to explain what it is they want or how they're being hurt, then they need their context evaluated to see exactly who is the parent that's hurting them and who is not. Who's the parent that's helping, who is not. This is the problem, because judges have a very wrong idea of how their morality should be used to make these decisions. And it's also why so often you have decisions being made in favor of the abuser. The research that's out there, the research we're just looking at right now, we're going to share some of those as we pull them up, says that most of the time when you have a woman coming forward saying this guy's being abusive, he's being traumatic, he's being violent, he's hurting the child, he's hurting me, there's domestic violence here, there's sexual abuse, what have you, the courts will not believe them. Not only will they not believe them, they will rule in favor of the abuser without an investigation. Why? Because their mandate is, one, preserve the family, two, go with the family member, give custody, full custody, to the family member who's the least aggressive and hostile and the most stable. Now, remember what the first steps in this spiral are. They isolate you financially, they isolate you socially, they isolate you emotionally, and they turn all of your family members against you to make you think you're crazy, and then they gaslight you. So you're resisting all that. And if you're spending all your energy resisting all that, from the outside, you look unreasonable, crazy, and like you're making shit up.
Because during that cycle of violence, I find that there is a point where the one that is being abused, say we're talking about the woman in this situation, she eventually becomes reactive to the abuse. And that is when the abuser will document. They will start to document how unstable you are, how abusive you are, verbally, emotionally, because you're now reactive to their abuse. And then that gets used against you, right? When it gets taken into the court.
By the court and by your own attorney. You'll have your attorneys will tell you, please be quiet. Please don't make these allegations. Please don't make these reports, because it will only make you appear to be the aggressor and unreasonable and hostile, because guess what? None of these people believe you, and there's not going to be an investigation.
No, so when I was looking initially to leave my girl's father, I went to a family lawyer, and his advice at that point was, like, putting aside the physical abuse that was going on, was to just stay in the home, because if I left the matrimonial home, that I would lose full custody of my kids immediately. That's how it was here. So his advice was to just try to survive. That's it. Just stay there.
Just try to lay back and enjoy it. Lay back and
try not to die is your best option to keep custody of your kids, is what they were saying.
Yeah.
It's great advice.
And if you decide to die, Canada now has deathbeds, so it's all good, right?
It's fine. And if you are going insane, you can just ask to be euthanized here. So there's always. Oh
God, I saw that. That's horrifying.
Yeah.
So that issue aside, you're absolutely right. This is how it gets the court. This is how the abuser, the aggressor, they set the stage for the courts and the law enforcement to be weaponized against you. And now they've done it with your kids too, because they're the ones that once they have access to the kids, they tell them stories that aren't true about why you're not talking. They block access, and now they are able to spin a narrative where, oh well, if they wanted to be here, they would be, or if they, If he wanted to call, he would, but he doesn't want to be part of your life. So even though they're the ones blocking all the access because they've weaponized the courts and law enforcement against you because you appear to be giving resistance to the abuse. And that, of course, is not acceptable.
No.
So this narrative, the narrative that they're creating is very early on set. All right. And we're seeing this, unfortunately, from the court and law enforcement from a financial lens where they're like, well, this woman is being insane. I don't like that. They don't have any access to money. I don't like that. And if they don't have money and they're not emotionally stable, how can they be what's best for the kid? I'd rather deal with the parent who's not screaming and making accusations, and it's going to make my police look bad, make me look bad, drag us all through the mud, and make us all responsible. I don't want that, so I'm going to go with the guy who is very good at making everyone happy. We call those psychopaths. So the psychopath is the one that can prevail initially in almost all these proceedings. The research shows that when you go in, even if you have full custody and you're up against a psychopath, in the initial round where there's no investigation and law enforcement is not helping and the courts are going just based on their gut feelings, psychopaths are going to win almost every time, like 88% of the time. It's not until you go through the whole process first, identify your trauma, identify what's happening, take stock, take inventory, make documentation, get real professionals involved, dump shitty lawyers, get real evaluations by real forensic experts, real investigations done. That is when you can produce that to the court, and that's when they win. But only the ones that stick it out, only the ones that stick through the process. And it can take years. That's the other thing. You got to settle in for the long haul because you're up against a system that rewards amiability, psychopathy, and negligence. You're not up against a system that rewards what you want, which is truth, investigations, effort, and accountability.
Yeah, and it's a dangerous situation to be in because, like you said, this can take time to get all this documentation in order and go to the right professionals and do all of that while, I guess, obeying the law of not leaving the matrimonial home, things like that in Canada anyway.
Not leaving the state with it. If you have the child, not leaving the state with them, or
yeah, and you're trying to basically keep everything secret, right? You're trying to do this and stay safe at the same time because that was a long process. Like for me to generate all those things that I needed, and it wasn't a lawyer that advised me to do it. It was common sense that I thought, okay, if I can get to the right people, the right professionals, document this, start a paper trail. I had a binder like this thick when I finally got to a lawyer that would listen, but that took quite some time. And meanwhile, while that was happening, that partner started to pick up on me being out of the house more often. I needed to get rides places, things like that, because I didn't have a vehicle, right? Because one vehicle would be fine because it was never home, so I couldn't go anywhere. Right. So then there was stalking that started after that. So all of these things to get to where you're talking about is very dangerous.
I like that you just said that because that's the other element that gets missed here. That when you weaponize the court, when you weaponize law enforcement, it involves falsely reporting that there's like the child is unsafe, or falsely reporting the child's been kidnapped, falsely reporting. Now, if you have a context where it's your day to have the child, or you don't know where the kids are, and you're supposed to be seeing them or talking to them, and a period of 24 hours has passed, you don't know what's going on. You don't know what's happening. So a welfare check is definitely in order. And if that welfare check turns up nothing, then the next step can be legitimately a kidnapping concern, right, of some kind. But if you are just doing it as the first step on at 12:01 a.m. on the day of your custody because you didn't get what you wanted, and you're in communication with the parent, then it's a false report. You can weaponize law enforcement, and then you can weaponize the courts. So you have to be very careful about when and how you involve law enforcement.
Very careful
because they're not always going to be there to help you. That's the other thing.
And most of the time, if you call law enforcement in a situation like you're explaining here, if there is no separation agreement or divorce agreement, if you're at the very beginning of this, and there is no agreement made by a court, they will just tell you, well, we can't do anything anyway. We can't do anything.
Yeah, that's his kid. You can't do anything. There's no agreement.
Can't do anything. He can keep the kid as long as he wants, even if you had an agreement verbal that they were going to drop him out. Anything, it doesn't matter.
Verbal agreements do not count. They are not a thing. Then law enforcement doesn't care.
And welfare check doesn't to a point, yes, you could get a welfare check, but at the beginning of it, if it was like, well, is the child with their father? Were they supposed to be with their father? Yeah. Well, how long has it been? It's similar to a missing person,
Yeah.
right? They want to wait so long with no contact to eventually send police to do something,
Right.
but they want to do as little as possible.
And then on the opposite end of that spectrum is the parent who, instead of weaponizing law enforcement, they're not doing that. They are just stalking and harassing the person in their regular life. They are doing drive-bys at the house when it's not their day to have custody. They are taking pictures. They are having private investigators go and say, "Oh, look, you're out in public doing this with this person. That's traumatic. I don't approve of that. You know, what have you." Or now there's a new person in your life and it's an intimate partner. Well, I'm going to do a background check on them and I don't approve of them. There's an extent to which that's reasonable. There's an extent to which it's not. And you can tell the difference by virtue of how focused they are on the welfare of the child. If they're just doing drive-bys and trying to engage the parents and engage other family members and harass the person, that's a problem. If they're going to their work, if they're doing this on hours when the child's supposed to be in the custody of the parent, that's a problem. But if they're not, the behavior depends. The danger of the behavior, the illegality of the behavior is entirely based on the context, not what's going on in the mind of anybody in terms of how you perceive it. You have to understand the full context and the full impact of that behavior in this context, in this relationship. And too often when law enforcement's looking at it, they're looking at it from a very two-dimensional, very, black and white perspective, instead of taking the time to look at the context and what the behavior means and who's actually in danger. And in all this, again, we're talking about this and the child is lost. The child is not getting asked. The child is not getting protected. And that's what I was trying to say before. So let me just explain what I said before. The family is a great idea for banks because family means mother, father, children, house, cars, vacations, credit cards. That's great for banks. Banks love that. That's a great model for social indentured servitude that a lot of people buy into. And, it has an appeal, right? But the part of that the other social part of that is the religious element. It's why religion is so much an infection in our culture, our society, our laws, because it tries to make laws and values in the image of the sort of nuclear family that it likes, because this is a way to transfer titles, properties, assets, and in those religious models, women and children are owned by men. That's why so many men like it, and why many women like it too. They like the idea of the security that can provide. I get it, but this is a matter of property and ownership. So in the U.S., women and children are viewed by our structures as property of men, not as people with rights. That's what marriage is. It's about the subordination. Half of me believes that's why the conservative right goes batshit crazy over the idea of gay marriage, because one, you're not producing biological heirs to transfer wealth and titles, but two, there's no women in that relationship, so there's no subordinate in their mind. They're like, why would you do that? You can't subordinate a person, which means they don't really actually understand people or relationships or what have you. So these ideas, these structures that exist, are very much designed to preserve what's the religious idea or what's become the nuclear idea of a family. But that's not what the United Nations says. The United Nations says, and this is is this part of the Children's Bill of Rights that the U.S. signed? This part of it?
The universal Declaration of Universal Rights. That's what the family definition.
Okay, the Declaration of Universal Human Rights from the UN says the definition of a family is a social structure that protects the rights of the people within it, makes them safe, keeps them healthy, and gives them access to resources. If you are not doing that, then whatever you've got is not a family.
I was going to say, so what would the percentage of families actually be by that definition? Right.
Because most of the time, family's not designed to do that, especially religious households. They're designed to prevent you from access from information. They don't want you having knowledge about your body. They don't want you having knowledge about healthcare. They don't want you to make decisions about your body or your healthcare. And they don't want you to make decisions about who it is you can be in a relationship with. Everything is about controlling you and limiting your rights and limiting your access to everything. And making sure that you understand you're not in charge. The head of the household is the father. So that's its own little problem.
Yeah.
But that I'm sure it's going to make a lot of people mad. Because, by the way, I want to make this very clear. A lot of people like that.
Yeah.
A lot of people like that and buy into it and think it's a good thing. Well, that's fantastic. And I think that's great. People can believe what they want up until the point where they are imposing that on another person, including a child.
Mm-hmm.
The child has to exist and have rights separate from the parents, not because of the parents, separate from the parents.
I don't think a lot of people understand
Well,
what the role or what the rights are of children. Aurelio was talking about it. Was it? Yes. When we were going through one of our presentations.
yesterday.
It was either mine or Stacy. I can't remember.
Yeah.
But the rights of the child within the home is like just the basic rights of a child that parents have no idea. Like just, he was saying, helping them clean, not just hygiene, but keeping a clean space. All of those things are part of your responsibility as a parent and the right of a child. But I don't think anyone knows that children have rights.
Well, let me put it another way. It's a little more frightening for me in the U.S. and I because of how law enforcement and the courts perceive the issue that the child is property, not with rights. And that is that if you intervene, let's say you have a child that is being physically abused in public, being hit or spanked in public. What can you do? In the United States, the tradition would be to do nothing and walk away because that parent is in charge and responsible for that child. And they can sue you if they intervene, or they can call the police and see you're the aggressor intervening with their parental rights, and it becomes about them. But actually, I was talking about Aurelio about this morning. The question isn't it's about responsibility. If it's not the person, if it's not the parent, who's responsible? And the answer is everyone. When it comes to a child, who's responsible? Everyone. Everyone is responsible. Everyone with an earshot, everyone with eyes, everyone with abilities has a responsibility to be protective when it comes to that child. Everyone.
And you know what I see here is when things like that are happening, it's passed off to, well, the teacher will notice, or a counselor, or the doctor should be aware. But
they're the worst. They don't want to testify. They don't want to write reports. They want to do nothing.
No. So no, everyone just turns a blind eye to
because those are what you're talking about is the concept of the mandated report. And if you're doing those kind of reports, you're not going to last long at your job because you're going to create liability for the institution. So if you're reporting these things on a regular basis, you're also incurring lawsuits from angry people.
Mm-hmm.
So the courts are allowing people to abuse them in this way. The law enforcement is adopting this mentality of, nobody should intervene. And people have become less willing to help out when they see this kind of stuff going on. Now, and this is a really interesting question. As you have more resources, the protection of the child goes down. That's the first thing, because your resources insulate you from intervention by other people. So what that means is in communities where there's more poverty, like indigenous communities or communities of that are marginalized on the outskirts of sort of society, they have a more inclusive view of what family is and what protection is. You're going to more likely to get help in a context like that because they have a community view of raising a child, because the parents aren't always available because they got to go work for the wealthy people.
Right.
Right. Yes. So we have to read to make this work. If we focus on the child, the issue of the nuclear family just dissolves into nothing, and it demonstrates the danger of that structure because of the ability of men to be in those relationships and control it the right way. Now, that doesn't mean it's only men. No. Women can do it too. Women can definitely do it. It just tends to be disproportionately men. But I will just say right up front, women are just as capable of being the aggressor in these situations as anyone else. I've experienced it. Other people have experienced it. So it's the statistics lean one way. That's the problem. If we just go by that and not look at investigating the specific case, that's the issue. But I wanted to say something that Aurelio mentioned that needed to be repeated here. And that is that given this context of this creation of this spiral whereby initially in the relationship, you're basically set up to look crazy later on when you start resisting, and that gives them full custody. What do you do? How do you survive? Well, what you got to do is first not give the aggressor further emotional access. And by that, I mean, you got to stop being in a position where you're responding to the horrible, shitty things they're doing to you. Yeah. And the reason why you're doing that is because you still care about them and you're still holding on to your identity that the future you that you were going to create with them, and you still want to hold on to punishing them for taking that away from you. Let it go. You gotta let all that go. that life is no longer your life. You're no longer connected to this person. So therefore, they no longer deserve emotional access to you, which means also you have no responsibility to explain shit to them about your life. So stop trying to do it. Save your resources financially, emotionally for your child, because that's the only thing that's going to carry you through. So when you got a toxic relationship, having a child, it makes things much more difficult, much more complicated. I'm not trying to oversimplify that.
No, and I was going to say it's not that easy if you haven't worked on yourself either to not respond, right? So it's an immediate reaction if you aren't aware of your own behavioral reactions from being triggered, or you have all this pent up anger and resentment and things like that. You have to work on yourself to learn how to control your own outbursts, because you can just fall into the cycle if you're not aware. You have to be aware that you have no other choice but to not engage.
And the
that's
professionals that are around you that are trying to help you maybe will tell you, don't go get counseling and therapy, because that's going to get used against you, like you're the emotionally unstable one.
And
so
it does.
requires professionals who are capable of looking at the case and going, okay, this person's in therapy because of all the shitty things this other person did. The fact that this person is not evidencing any trauma or any emotional requirement for therapy means that they're the one who actually is inflicting the damage. So they're not fine. They're the abuser, the one who's suffering. That if this were physical damage, physical injury, it will be understood immediately, because it's emotional. In the way we treat mental illness, we treat it as the fault of the person, not of their not as a consequence of their context. So we have to have professionals who are better at understanding that and describing it. And these traits that we talked about, these toxic traits and contexts that are created, they're designed specifically to manipulate the system, specifically because they work in context of basically confusing or misdirecting professionals who are not interested in doing their jobs, who just like easy, uncomplicated stereotypes, and who may have their own. That's the other problem. Too many of the people who work in this profession have their own issues that they're not able to cleave away. That's been a real challenge for a lot of people. I know it's a challenge for you on your work. I know it's a challenge for everyone on his. It's definitely a challenge for me on mine. When you have your own issues, it creates a blind spot that you have to be able to overcome. Mm-hmm. That's not saying it's impossible. It's just saying that too many people ignore that and they just lean into their bias and their crusade, right? That's the other problem.
That was we just spoke about that. That was one of the hardest things for me because of my historical trauma and abuse. When I was working custody cases, initially I would become very triggered, and I could see that I was putting myself into the middle of it. But you, again, have to know that about yourself, become aware, and then stop doing that.
To resist and take care of others, you start with self-care. That's exactly right. Exactly. I just said it better than me, which is that self-care is the most powerful form of resistance, because it gives you the resource, it preserves your resources and allows you to take care of your child. All right, that's the thing. And also it deprives the abuser, the aggressor, of the fuel that they need to keep making you look like you're the unstable, violent, or unreliable one. Or
Can I say something?
Yeah.
There's a double-edged sword in what you just said as well, because when people get to a point that they have done their own work, they are taking care of themselves, they're putting the children first, and they learn to not react out of emotion.
Yeah.
That sometimes can be looked at as negative as well, because then you are now emotionless or a robot, or you must not care. It's like you can't win. No matter what you do, there is a hurdle, and there's always going to be someone telling you that you're doing it wrong.
So you just answered your own question. That's exactly right. Since there's always going to be somebody there telling you that you're doing it wrong, if you're always putting the child first in these cases, it's going to be very clear what your priorities are. Even if you're making a mistake, if you're doing it, because that's the first thing. You're going to make mistakes. Everybody's going to make mistakes. That's okay. You don't want to ding people for the mistakes they're making when they're trying to help the child, right? Yeah. When they're trying to get the help they need to be for themselves, or to get the help they need for the child. Those things have got to be looked at as more heroic and more brave than the person's, I could just take it. No, you can't take it. You're going to take it, and then you're going to give it out to somebody else, and they're going to have to take it. So that they're absolutely right. There's a double-edged sword. But the other thing is, there aren't two settings, 0 and 100. That's not a thing. That's a thing for somebody who can't regulate. Yeah. So if you're being portrayed as someone who's at 100 for stuff where I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. What you're supposed to do is this, or what is most healthy in this situation is this. be reacting emotionally for the crowd is the danger. It's like the defendant sitting at the table in front of the judge being told by their lawyer, do not emote. And what they do is they don't emote, and the jury says, aha, he showed no emotions. He's a psychopath.
Yeah.
If you give too much emotions, oh my God, he's insane. He's obviously guilty. Both things can be used against you.
Yeah.
What you should be doing is reacting genuinely to the things that genuinely hurt you. Reacting but the histrionics are the danger. The over the top stuff is the danger. When you're reacting in such a way that you're not protecting yourself or the kid, that's when you know you're doing the wrong reaction.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing an unhealthy reaction. But reacting healthy, having emotions, there's nothing wrong with that at all. That's good. That's a great sign, especially if it's for the thing. If your emotions are, if your emotional response is in a place of protection of yourself or protection of your child. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
That's the danger of the double-edged sword. It's going to happen. They're going to interpret it however they want.
Yeah.
And what that means is you have to be better about documenting it.
Well, a certain level of emotional intelligence goes a long way in those situations.
Well, there is that. there
is that, but it's not common.
No, and you're not dealing with people who care about that. That's the thing. If you've got a lot of the times when you're in court, here's a dirty secret that most people do not know. When a judge is making a decision in a court hearing, it is very rare that they haven't already made the decision weeks before they even go into the courtroom. And it does not matter what you say or what you're going to do. So what you have to do is be able to either create arguments that they cannot get around, that put them in jeopardy of an appeal if they actually, go with their gut and their lack of knowledge of the law. That's the other thing. Most judges actually don't know the law. And you can tell this from a very, very, very simple metric. If you go to court and the judge does not want oral arguments, they just want written arguments, just submit your report and I'll read them. That's actually a good thing because that means the judge is going to go do some research. Because so when I say judges don't know the law, that's not a pejorative. I'm not speaking negatively. I'm speaking the truth. Nobody knows all the law all the time. So you've got to go do your research to find out what the current state of the law is based on the most recent rulings. And that's why courthouses have law libraries in them, because not everybody knows the law, right? But most judges are not willing to acknowledge when they don't know the law. Those judges, what they will do is they'll say, I want oral arguments in my chambers, or I want oral arguments in court. And that means they're not going to read it. They just want you to make the argument, explain it, so they don't have to think. Mm-hmm. That's always the danger to me. So that is a big impediment that we have to be better about getting over, but we also have to be capable of communicating to judges in a way that they are forced to hear. And when they aren't, you got to be relentless about appeals. That also presumes you've got a good attorney. If you don't got a good attorney representing you, you're not going to get hurt either. So having a good attorney that can hear you and that can adequately communicate what's going on to the judge, those are huge deals. And they do not always, they rarely exist. I'll put it that way. So,
I was going to ask that in the family court system, how often would that exist?
Oh my God. Family court system is a nightmare. It's a nightmare.
It's a nightmare.
But it's also, it's populated heavily by professionals who either don't know what they're doing or have extreme biases one way or the other that they are imposing on the system. Mm-hmm. And that's under the case where they're motivated. Then you have a lot of them are not motivated. A lot of them are people who are not qualified to even be doing the job that they're doing. Or they couldn't, either they're lawyers that couldn't make it in criminal and civil cases are the most complex. That requires a special kind of lawyer. And then criminal laws, where almost all of them start out. And if they're any good, they wind up going private. If they're not, they stay working for the state. That's just the bottom line. And I don't mean working for the state like public defender. There are a lot of really good public defenders out there, but I met very few prosecutors who were not politicians, who were not politically motivated. So if you're any good as a good prosecutor, you would naturally move on from that into private practice because you would outgrow it, frankly, intellectually you would, unless you have a extreme ideological bias that's keeping you either ideologically or politically in this pathway. All right.
Think about it. I was just going to say, anyone who's listening to what you just said, think about how terrifying that is when you think about custody and children, and the least experienced and professional people are the ones running that
Well, what I have observed in the custody situations that I've been a part of is that the people who are lawyers in those contexts are not the best lawyers. They're the ones at the least able, at the bottom of the rung. That needs to change. I mean, there are some very good ones. Don't get me wrong. Very good, very motivated ones. They are rare. They're rare and criminal. I mean, I can tell you right now, I've met thousands of lawyers in my career, and there's only about 4 right now that I would call if I needed a defense. Out of those thousands, I would not call any of the rest of them. I could name them for you right now. And those are the people who read their case and know the law, and act reasonably.
You mean they actually read the file?
They actually read the file. That's my first threshold. That eliminates 80% of lawyers. They don't read the file. By the way, most judges do. So that's the problem. That's lawyers on both sides. So this impediment exists and this reality exists, but what wins these cases is putting in the time and preserving your resources. So accepting that it's going to take a long time, conserving your resources and not expending them on the abuser or the aggressor. Now, that's an ideal. Obviously, every case is going to be different, but that's what you should be aiming for. Less interaction, less responsivity, less sort of taking the bait, for lack of a better word. All right. This is a big conversation. I know. Anything you want to close out with at the end there? Because there's a lot here, and there's
a lot to unpack. I think there's a lot of things that people don't understand about custody battles. That's essentially what they are. Yep. And that we all believe that the kids come first, and they don't. I know from personal experience, a friend of mine who went into a custody battle with a partner who lived in a known drug house, and that child got to go back and forth with everybody knowing where that kid was for 4 days out of the week, hardly getting fed. And there was just, well, that's a parenting style. That was what the courts told the other parent. It's a parenting style. We can't do anything about it at this point. The kids are not, their best interest, their safety is not priority when it comes to any of these cases.
It's parenting. The parents are the primary concern, the rights of the parents, instead of the rights of the child and the protection of that child from the family. This is the hard thing for the courts and law enforcement to get their head on, because there's so much religion in the courts and so much religion in law enforcement, or so many of those kinds of gender stereotypes. We basically have a family unit that we're trying to protect and preserve, and that's what's best for the child. Mm-hmm. No, it often is not. It is often not what's best for the child. It's what's best for, churches and banks and men who are very religious. That's what's best for. It's not best for the woman. It's definitely not best for the child in many cases. And we're seeing, what I'm trying to say is, we're seeing too often those, the abuser winning in court, winning full custody because of the context that they have created, the mischaracterizing the resistance as craziness or instability, and professionals being unwilling to examine these cases and not understanding trauma well enough to do it. They're coming in, you got psychologists coming in with checklists who really don't know what they're doing half the time, who are really favoring heavily the preservation of the family unit, and not concerned at all with the impact that this is going to have on the child. No. Really, is there anything you think we should add to this before we sign off? Because there's some thoughts.
The instrumentalization of the children, just that concept.
Okay. I think is so we're going to, Melanie and Aurelio and I, we're going to be doing a seminar on child custody issues and trauma and violence in child custody cases. We're going to be doing that, I think, not this week, but next. We'll make an announcement about it. And one of the key concepts that will be part of that seminar is the idea of instrumentalization. When those people who are in the justice system, who are victims or who are suffering harm, they are instrumentalized by the aggressor, by law enforcement, by the judiciary to push ideological or personal agendas. This is a very big problem, because instrumentalization means you're pretending to put them front and center to help them, but there is no actual help for them. It's only helping you, or helping you with your ideological beliefs and narratives. So recognizing when this is happening is a really big, there's a lot of literature about this, and it's a really big, important step professionally for those who are doing custody evaluations to take. If you're doing custody evaluations and you're not identifying whether and how the child is being instrumentalized by one group or another, then you're missing the boat. You're missing the picture. You're not seeing what's actually going on. You want to pitch in on that, Melanie, or what are you thinking?
No, I was just going to say to maybe give some idea to the people who are watching about us taking on these types of cases, looking at custody cases, and how often that has happened before.
Yeah, a lot.
Experts going in to look at this is something in Canada that's unheard of, right? Like, we don't have people looking at the custody cases the way that we are, with all of what you were just saying, how to recognize all of these things. We have professionals that have no idea what they're doing. And so we recognize that this is a missing piece. So our seminar is to help lots of people.
Lots of people, not only people who are suffering. We want to do a seminar, basically people who are suffering in it right now in a custody situation, and then also evaluators and psychologists who maybe realize the limitations of what the training they've received has been.
That's right.
Any other thoughts on that, Aurelio? Because that's a pretty big one. He's good. Okay, great.
Right. Okay, great.
Put his thumb up.
He's quiet.
Wow, that's never been true, but okay.
I know.
So this is about making sure people have understanding of context and giving some tools and some language just in an immediate sense to those people who might need it, because we have been involved in these cases for years, for me 26 years, from the perspective of the criminal cases where child custody evaluations are a red flag, but we never get the cooperation of not right up front of child protective services or child family services. We have to force them to give over their files because they're not working with law enforcement, because what they've done is so dangerously negligent most of the time that it cannot be trusted or relied upon, or it reveals something that's contrary to what law enforcement has done. So that part of it has always been family court, child custody evaluations have always been very sectioned off. So we've come into these cases, and the more cases we work where we get access to that material, we're realizing the limitations. We're realizing the lack of professionalism. Really realizing the lack of consistent language, or even understanding what trauma is, or even, I mean, you have child custody evaluators. One of the things I love about TikTok is that child custody evaluators getting filmed, giving shitty advice to teenage girls who are being abused in their homes. One of the most famous ones was where the child custody evaluator is like, look, yeah, I know it's bad, but if you want to eat, if you want to make money, you can go down on the corner, you can make some money. I mean, you're an attractive girl. That's somebody working with the state saying that. You know what I mean? So we're at a point right now in our understanding of the legal system and our understanding of human rights where this subject becomes necessary, because it's the only preventative step that we're going to be taking in our casework. All the rest of our criminal casework is after the fact. So the child custody stuff, if we start working on it early on, you can prevent the slide into something worse. So, in
an effort to help the child or children.
First, to protect their rights, and second, to prevent further trauma. Because the complex trauma is what we want to avoid, right? If we can intervene. And that's the thing. Understanding that complex trauma often comes from the parents who shouldn't be doing what they're doing. It takes everybody to step in and do this, including experts, including the courts, including law enforcement. So we welcome everybody to attend, especially from their perspective. It's going to be in a couple weeks. It'll be about 4 hours long. You, me, and Aurelia will be speaking. We might have some other people. We'll look into it, but look for an announcement. And thank you for staying with us. Melanie, anything last to add before we go? Or are we good?
We are good.
That's hardly ever the case. So thank you very much. All right. This has been The Hard Truth. Thank you so much for being with us this hour.